From McFarland Publishing, this is Best Part of the Book, Conversations with Nonfiction Authors published by McFarland. I'm Mark Purcell. This is a conversation with Janet Pittard, author of A Hospital for Ashe County, 4 Generations of Appalachian Community Healthcare, published by McFarland Books in 2016. You can purchase a copy of the book from mcfarlandbooks.com and receive a 25% discount with the code BESTPART. When you live in a city, you take access to healthcare for granted. It's everywhere. But in a poor, rural county, in an isolated corner of the North Carolina mountains, such care was and still is difficult to find. It took generations and a dedicated community to build the first hospital during hard times, the waning days of the Great Depression. This is the story of the generations of supporters, doctors, nurses, and others whose lives are interwoven with regional healthcare and the planning, building, and operation of the new Ashe Memorial Hospital. Joining me for this chapter of Best Part of the Book, Janet C. Pittard, author of A Hospital for Ashe County. Thanks for joining me, Janet.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here.
You know, you set the stage in your book by describing what healthcare looked like in the early to late 1800s. And, well, frankly, it's not what anyone would call healthy care today. It's kind of set the stage for what it was like here in Ashe County there in the 19th century.
Well, back in the old days, you're right, there really wasn't anything that we would refer to as healthcare these days. There were grannies with potions and poultices that you hung around your neck and things like that. There were a great reliance on old Indian remedies and herbs, and there were a few people that folks went to that were not medically trained, but just had been around for a long time and were familiar with what was available in the way of herbs and old time Indian remedies and things that had been passed down from the old country. And that's what people relied on. There were no doctors, certainly no hospital. And as things progressed, there were midwives that delivered almost all of the babies. Since there were no hospitals or doctors, babies were born in people's homes. Midwives were not necessarily medically trained, at least not until many years later. They were required to have some credentials. But in the early days, the only thing that really qualified you to be a midwife was that you'd had a bunch of children yourself. So there were midwives that went out in the middle of the night on horseback to help women that were usually their neighbors, and that's how things were done. And when doctors finally came, they were maybe well trained and maybe not. They may have interned under another doctor rather than gone to some kind of a university for an official degree or training like that. So it was pretty tough going, but the people in the mountains, as you know, are a pretty tough breed, and they learn to rely on themselves and on the other people in their community that were proficient in different ways of healing people. So it was you were really starting from scratch in the high country, and in Appalachia in general, you were starting from scratch with healthcare. And it has really come a long, long way. But sometimes you still have folks back in the holler that rely very heavily on these old remedies, and some of them work pretty good and they don't have the kind of side effects that modern day medicine does. So you can't poo-poo the way they did things in the old days, because sometimes it works better than what we have today.
Indeed. I was fascinated by how people learned medicine by watching others do medicine. It wasn't necessarily, as you said, a formal education, but learning from people who had been practicing their quote unquote medicine for so long. And there were a number of very notable practitioners in Ashe County at that time.
That's right. And they were surprisingly proficient at their craft. And many would stack up with modern day medical professionals. They were very lucky in Ashe County to have a few people in those early days that were proficient at their medical practice, and some were extremely well trained. They were many times natives of the area, and these 4 generations in the same family that carried healthcare, the main burden of healthcare in Ashe County specifically, and in all the areas right over the Virginia line. They were very well educated, and they just came back home rather than go off to some big city like Philadelphia or Chicago or something like that to practice. They came back home. That was lucky for people in Ashe County and the surrounding area.
These people who learned and came back to Ashe County really did help the county survive. They lived quite a tough life, the life of a horseback doctor, you call it. And what they did was just incredible. They made an effort caring for the community that you rarely see.
Well, that's right. The Bud Jones, Dr. Bud Jones, the first of those 4 generations that was well known in the area, he was what I refer to as a horseback doctor. And he certainly was not the first in the area. There were others that came before him, but he would go out and do his rounds. Now, he would be covering a territory that extended from Ashe County up into Virginia. And he would know there's no car now and not very good roads. And he would be on horseback, and sometimes he would have to ride, like miles and miles to get to a patient. Even in later years, it was still hard for doctors to get to a patient that was back up in the back country of Ashe County. I have a picture in the book of a lady's husband poling across the river to pick up Dr. Elam Kurtz, who's standing on a snowbanked side of the river with his doctor bag and his big coat on, waiting for the man to pole across the river to pick him up, to take him back across to treat his patient. When Dr. Bud Jones, the first of the 4 generations, when he was making his calls on horseback, he would sometimes come back in the middle of the night or the early hours of the morning, and his boots would be frozen to his stirrups. The horse just knew where he was supposed to go, and Dr. Bud would be asleep in the saddle, and he would make it home, and his wife would take a hot kettle out there and pour it on his stirrups to unfreeze his boots so he could get off the horse. Now that's pretty tough. That's pretty tough going.
Very tough going. Janet C. Pittard, author of A Hospital for Ashe County, 4 Generations of Appalachian Community Healthcare. Speaking with me, Mark Purcell, here on Best Part of the Book. And I suppose we should really provide a setting for what Ashe County is like today and has been for quite some time. I mentioned, poor, isolated, and this really was what some historians have called the lost province of North Carolina.
At the time, early on, of course, there was no highways, no nice 4-lane highways crisscrossing the mountains. There was no train, and for people to get anywhere, they had to go on horseback or wagon, and it was not people just didn't get in and out of the high country. Most people never went outside of their own little community. And when the railroad came, it opened up access, and that made a lot of difference to people's access to health care. And they were able to go on the train, maybe to Abington or even as far as Philadelphia in some cases. But in the meantime, with the advent of the automobile, people were able to get to Wilkes. There was a hospital there, and people were able to get there. But by the time you got all the way to the Wilkes Hospital, If you had anything really bad wrong with you, like acute appendicitis, which was very common in those early days, you would be the patient would be dead. So people said that you went to Wilkes to die. It was tough, even with an automobile, like to go on that windy route to get to Wilkes County. And the situation with EMT with an ambulance early on was that there was no such thing as an ambulance service per se. In most areas, the funeral home served as the ambulance service. Now that seems almost like a conflict of interest, but uh, you had 2 funeral homes, and they both offered this service where you instead of calling 911, you called the funeral home and asked if you could get an ambulance to take your, loved one to, Wilkes. And in one case, I was interviewing Mr. Badger, with Badger Funeral Home, and he recalled he was actually stay at the funeral home all night long. He was like on duty, 24/7, and he would stay there and take calls from people that were had an emergency and needed an ambulance. And he would drive on those windy roads to it took a patient one time that was at the hospital, at Ash Memorial Hospital, the old one, and the child, was really bad off and was gonna in danger of dying in within a couple of hours, and he drove that child and his mother from the Old Ash Memorial Hospital to Winston, and, Doctor Dean C. Jones, the 2nd generation, he had called ahead to Winston, and they were waiting at the emergency room entrance for this child, and Mr. Badger just flew that route in some incredible amount of speed. He could have probably been hanging right in there with the bootleggers as far as how fast he was going, but he got that child there and they were waiting for him at the hospital and the kid made it. And his mother brought the little boy to see Mr. Badger a few weeks later so that he could see that the boy had lived through the experience. But he said, Badger told me that he looked in his rearview mirror to see how the mother and the kid were doing, and he said he didn't know uh, who looked who looked worse, the mother who was kind of holding her breath the whole way about how fast it was going, or the child that was in danger of dying. It was wild times just getting there, not just the transportation, the mode of transportation, but the weather. And, trying to get somewhere in the mountains when you got 3 feet of snow on the ground is a whole whole 'nother set of challenges.
Well, the hospital in the title is not necessarily the first hospital that Ashe County had. That was the Jones Memorial Infirmary in Lansing.
That's
Uh,
right. That is, many people refer to that as the first hospital. There's still bits of it standing that you can see, and there's a couple of old pictures in the book that show it when it was in a little bit better state of repair, but, it was a very simple building.
you talked about generations, the 4 generations of Appalachian community healthcare, and you've already mentioned the first generation, Dr. Arthur Lee Bud Jones. Dr. Bud, he was quite a character.
He was, and he must have been a real impressive sight. I've always thought that there should be a movie that started with him, and maybe Kevin Costner could play his part. But he was he was a very tall man for his time and well over 6 feet. So he was imposing just in his stature, and he had red hair and was very handsome. And so I can just imagine him coming across some mountain path on astride his horse with his doctor bag and the snow falling and things like that. He was a very strict fella, no drinking, no cussing, no gambling, nothing like that. And he passed that along to the next generation, his son, the first dean, Dr. Dean, the second generation, and he was much the same way. As a matter of fact, he was doing a surgery at the old hospital, and one of the nurses, now you remember there's not a very big staff there. There was one of his nurses, her shift was over, and she had gone out to her car, and there was some man that I guess drunk, and he had gotten in the back seat of her car and passed out. And she went to get in her car to go home, and here's this guy in the back seat. And she runs back into the hospital, right into where they're doing the surgery, because that's the only place where there's anybody else in the hospital. She runs in there and screaming that there's some man is in her car. And Dr. Jones turns around and says, "I'll be with you in just a minute. Let me close this guy up." And so he finishes what he's doing without batting an eye, and he stalks out there to the where her car is parked and grabs that guy by the feet and just yanks him out of the car and plops him on the on the gravel. And, well, that was the end of that. We didn't hear from that fella again. And I wouldn't have wanted to cross him. He would fix you up if you were messed up, but he wouldn't model coddle you if you were doing something you weren't supposed to.
Not at all. And really that second generation, Dean Jones Sr. is the hero of this story to some degree. He drove the building of this hospital in 1941.
That's right. And uh, when he was in the midst of that crusade to get that hospital built, he would get in his car and go out to or get on his horse and go out into the back country and find guys sitting on the front porch telling tales and swapping the jug, and he would say, I need some help over here at the hospital finishing up, the roof or the back end of it or whatever." And he'd say, "Can y'all give us a hand?" And they would show up, and because he asked them to, and would lend a hand. So when we say that people in Ashe County built the hospital, they literally built the hospital. They offered their own uh, supplies and shingles left over from some other job and posts and things like that. So the original structure was just this total mismatch of leftover parts from from other buildings, new and old. And it was the if you went in there and saw it when it was being renovated, you just saw this total collection of lumber and other building supplies that had gone into the initial construction. But they built a pretty solid building, and it lasted for its time and for its purpose.
It sure was. Now, this hospital was built with some Works Progress Administration funds, but really it was community fundraising that raised the money to help build, along with those contributions of various materials.
That's right. It was a WPA project, and Congressman Doughton did a whole lot to get that project in Ashe County, that hospital in Ashe County. And he was a character that reminds me a little bit of Dr. Bud, that first generation. He was a big, tall man. Uh, they called him Farmer Bob in Congress, and he got that money for through the WPA, which was for the construction of the hospital. There was no money from the federal government for outfitting the hospital, for putting beds in there and things like that. There was nothing like that. That it was just for the construction of the hospital. So the community, as well as providing some of the labor and some of the supplies, they they bought the beds, and or else they brought in beds that were from home, and they didn't have any money for operating costs and things like that. So people would actually, if they had leftover vegetables, they had a good crop of cabbage one year, they'd bring in the extra potatoes or the extra cabbage or whatever. They bring it into the hospital for them to use uh, in the cafeteria there, or that fed the patients.
A few stories from a hospital for Ashe County, 4 generations of Appalachian community healthcare. I'm talking with Janet Pittard here on Best of the Book. I'm Mark Purcell. And I have to say, this building looks like other WPA buildings. It's built out of that gray stone that we see all around for those Works Progress Association constructions. But it kept getting added onto. You mentioned a mishmash, some of that Appalachian ingenuity using what you have. And they did that when they were expanding the hospital as well.
That's correct. And they built a couple of wings in all directions, and they also built a nurses' quarters out back, which for a long time was used as a daycare. When it was quit being a hospital there, they used that building for a daycare center, and they had other additions and improvements that they made. I mean, they added elevators to it and things like that. But it was in the current use for the old hospital, which is as a senior living place. They have the developer that started that project did leave the original building. If you just stood in the hallway and looked up and down the hallway, it would look just like it did during the days that it was a hospital. The doors are in the same place, and windows and in the same place. And of course, it's completely repurposed, but it it still looks like it did in its days when it was the hospital. But they had a emergency room down in the basement, and that's where the ambulance would pull in. And it was very similar in the look of it to WPA projects in the county, like the school over in Lansing and the community house in West Jefferson that's now used by the Arts Council, and various things like that. So they all had that stone construction, because we got in Ashe County, as you know, we've got no shortage of rocks. And so that was about the best thing that you could use for construction. And of course it lasts, and you still have the buildings that still stand that were WPA projects. They're still here. They might be used for something different, but they're still standing.
So when we mention our hero of the story, Dr. Dean Jones, recruiting workers to complete the building, he became the superintendent and resident physician and surgeon, and he was truly a resident. He lived in the hospital for 15 years, right?
That's correct. He had 2 rooms. One was a little bedroom that he shared with his wife, and the other was a little sitting room where Dean C. Jr. Slept on the couch.
That meant that he was basically always at work.
He was, which was very handy for his staff, but must have been really exhausting for him.
Dean Jones went on to instill that love of medicine in the 3rd generation there, Dean Jones Jr.
Well, he basically grew up in the hospital and was going to be a doctor from the beginning. I think there was no question in his mind. It was not that anybody pressured him. He just assumed that was his destiny, and he would be bouncing his basketball up and down the halls, but he also would watch surgeries and things like that when he was very, very young years. And he grew up and went on to educate himself to be a doctor, and he had basically served an internship already. But he was a great doctor, and did some of everything, just like his father and his grandfather. That was the thing that most impressed me about this line of doctors and these doctors of past generations. Nowadays, somebody goes in and they might see a half a dozen different doctors for if they've been in an accident or had some severe uh, injury of some kind. And in those days, there were no specialists really, certainly not in Ashe County. And you went in and that one doctor fixed everything. And it might not be his so-called specialty, but his specialty, which turns out to be just about everything. The first Dean Jones, the third generation's father, he did a procedure that amounted to a brain surgery where he drilled a hole in the skull and relieved pressure and things like that. And it's just was a whole different way of doing things. But the thing that fascinated me about Dr. Dean C. Jr., who they called Doc, uh, was that he did everything very well. They said that he could, before the X-ray was developed, he just by touch he could tell where a fracture or a break was, and
Wow.
his stitches were so fine that the hospital in Charlotte recruited heavily to get him to come and be a plastic surgeon. And my best way to explain the range of skill set that he had and other doctors in that era was a story about the bridge collapse at Silas Creek, which was in 1966, I believe. And a fellow there, he was driving a big truck that had a tractor on the bed of the truck. He was taking the tractor to another job, and the bridge couldn't hold the weight of the truck and the tractor, and it collapsed. And when it collapsed, the tractor that was on the bed of the truck went through the rear windshield and into the driver's seat and almost cut the guy in half. They had to call the hospital and have Dr. Dean C come out to the site with two nurses from the hospital and crawl into the wreckage of the bridge collapse. Now this is all this steel and steel girders and everything. They're all in the Russian River below. And he crawls into that with one of the nurses and stabilizes the patient with morphine and comes out with the nurses. They have a EMT is there now, and now that the patient's stabilized, they can extract him from the wreckage, and they take him to the hospital in the ambulance. And that same doctor that crawled into the wreckage, which was a dangerous, dangerous thing to have to do, that same doctor fixes all the fractured ribs, fixes all the fractured ribs and all of the other broken bones. And then he stitches up this man's face, which has gone through the windshield and is all has terrible lacerations. He almost lost his nose, and he had a cut across his mouth that almost, split him in his face in two. Had these horrific injuries to his face, not to mention the rest of his body, which had almost been cut in half. And he stitches together this guy's face, and of course, he stays in the hospital for a couple of weeks, but he did it all. He did it all from stabilizing him in the wreckage to taking care of him in the hospital and fixing all this stuff that this day and age would have probably taken 6 different doctors to do
Right.
over a period of 2 months. And I met this man that was in this accident, and it was amazing. You would think that somebody that had had this kind of trauma to their body would have a limp or their face would be disfigured or something like that. And you look at this man and you would never guess that he had been in any kind of horrific accident like this. And so those plastic surgery stitches he was getting in his face must have been they must have really been the thing that he needed. I was sitting there talking to him and his wife was there with him. And I said, Billy Ray, tell me how long was it before you got your looks back? Anyway, he thought that was hysterical.
Well, I have to say this healthcare legacy continues to today with the fourth generation of Dr. Jones, Dr. Charles W. Jones, who continues to practice today, and really how the Jones family built up a community around this healthcare. I know we talk community healthcare, but it really was a community of nurses and other practicing physicians who came through, all drawn by the energy of the Jones family.
That's right. And I even the wives of these different generations were very heavily involved in this. Evelyn Jones, Dean C. Doc Jones's wife, was very instrumental in setting up organizations locally to fundraise and do things for diabetes and heart disease. And the same with Letty, that was the wife of Dean Sr. For many years, she ran the hospital. He was the surgeon, and she was like the hospital manager before they actually had somebody that was officially called that. I mean, she did the billing and she, got people registered and all kinds of things like that. They were a real team. And Dr. Bud's wife, he trained her to be his nurse. She was the anesthetist for his surgeries, and she had no medical training other than what he had taught her, which must have been substantial, because she would like what they referred to as dripped the anesthesia for the patients. And she would stay when he would go out to perform a surgery on location at somebody's house. She would go with him, and she, after he'd done the surgery on somebody's dining room table, she would stay there and look after the patient for a couple of days to make sure that they were stabilized. So it was a team effort through those generations as far as the doctor and their spouse, and it very much a family affair.
Indeed, and it went to other families as well. I'm thinking of
Very much so. Uh,
Henry Lum and
Henry Lum and the Kurtzes. There are two generations. Dr. Kevin Kurtz that's practiced now. It was his father that came into the practice with uh, Dean C. Jr. And so there are people that came in, joined the uh, medical profession here in Ashe County, and extended the level of expertise and service in ways that are pretty impressive.
so we talked about the four generations of the Jones family who have really established community healthcare here in Ashe County and all the other families that joined in. And you learned about all these monumental achievements by doing quite a few interviews. You write at one point in the book, interviewing's like trying to eat one potato chip. You can't do just one, and I can see why. I'm fascinated. What were your favorite interviews?
My favorite interviews were the ones that I did with the oldest people. And I did over 100 interviews, and a significant percentage of the people that I interviewed were in their 90s, and most are not around anymore since I have written the book. But my very favorite interview, um, and I enjoyed very much interviewing Billy Ray and Betty Miller, that were the story of the Silas Bridge collapse. Other than that, my favorite interview was with Emmett Barker, who was well into his 90s when I talked to him in February of 2015. And he sort of epitomized to me the way that things were done in the old days, not just in terms of the kind of doctrine you got, but how people approached injury and things like that in a rural county that didn't have a lot of wealth to spread around. And he was only a young boy and I'm going to read you this little bit of this section here. Not it was very short. He was only a young boy in 1935 when he rolled off a horse-drawn sled loaded with corn, and his fall landed him in the spreads, or what are referred to as single trees. That's like the wooden rails attaching the wooden sled to the team of horses. And he said, I broke my arm real bad, tells Emmett. The team was unhitched from the sled, and Emmett rode one of the horses into Lansing to Dr. Bud Jones's two-room office. And that was located at the turn to go to the old Lansing school. So it's right downtown. There were no automobiles then, and it was getting late in the day. The bone had splintered, so Dr. Bud had to open up the arm to repair the break. He had an operating table not bigger than an ironing board. It took him about 1.5 hours to fix my arm. If you dropped a bomb, he wouldn't hurry him up when he was working, but he knew what he was doing. And when the doctor was finished setting the arm, Emmett rode the horse back home. And he estimates it was about 4 miles each way. Now, is that not just Ashe County in the old days? I mean, this kid, he, this kid falls into the wooden rails there and rides with this busted up arm all the way into town, 4 miles into town, gets his arm fixed, and then rides back. I mean,
Mountain metal for sure.
that's right.
Mountain metal.
That's right. Another interview that I really enjoyed was a lady named Beulah Barker. Her story it was like February 1967, and she was ready to deliver her second child, and she made her trip to Ashe County Memorial, the old hospital, and her husband was overseas, so she drove herself, and the birth was pretty rough, and Dr. Dean had to perform surgery on her. Meanwhile, this ice storm comes and it's bent all the trees to the ground, and the roads were starting to get bad, and folks are stranded at the hospital. And Beulah had things to do at home, she said, including getting back to the other child who was just a little baby left in the care of her mother. It was time to go. So Beulah is she asks an orderly to bring her car around to the ER entrance and bundles up the new baby, grabs her belongings, and heads for her car. Now, a nurse sees her put the baby in the front seat and came over to investigate. And Beulah, seeing her escape was about to be thwarted, slid over into the passenger seat with the baby and tells this fib that her brother's just visiting a friend in the hospital and he'll be right out. And the nurse leaves, and Beulah slid back in the driver's side and made her getaway. Now, see, it was a long drive home, and the roads had gotten really bad. And the bridge at Silas Creek, the same one that collapsed later on, was out. So she had to drive all the way around Lansing, 19 miles, easing the car under the ice-laden branches along the way. Now, with the perseverance reminiscent of her Ashe County forebears, she made it home safe, her baby not uttering a peep, and got back to her chores. Anyway, she when she was a grown woman, all past, and this was long in her memory, she was still a feisty person, and I could see her doing this. People just did what they had to do.
So many stories. You said over 100 interviews. I'm just curious, how did you figure out where to start, Janet?
Well, that's a good question. And I'm not sure how I figured that out. My ace in all my writing is my younger brother, David Chiswell, and he does my heavy research, the stuff that requires going into the state archives and putting microfiche, going through microfiche and finding old Skyland Post newspaper articles that related to everything that went into this book. He collected information on doctors and nurses and staff and the accident with the tractor and the bridge collapse. And he, he got me all the things that I needed to get dates right and the sequence of events right and things like that. And I could not have done the book without his expertise at research gathering. He would give me stuff a little bit at a time, newspaper articles. He would copy them and he would highlight what he thought I should use, and then sit down with me and go through it. And my other big ace was I had two people that helped me, guided me in the right direction and stuck with me through the whole process. And one, of course, was Evelyn Jones, Dr. Charles Jones's mother. And she would suggest to me people that would be good to interview because she knew everybody in the county and beyond and knew how to get to them. And she would ride with me. Sometimes she would help me in many cases set up the interview. She would call the person that I needed to talk to and convince them that I was okay to talk to and they could trust me and that she would come with me. And so nobody was going to turn Evelyn Jones down. They would have certainly turned me down because they didn't know me from Jonah, and I was not from around here. And so she was very helpful in getting me in as far as these all these interviews were concerned. And then just like you were recalling in my text. Once you start interviewing one person, everybody in Ashe County knows everybody else, if even if they're not related to them.
Yes,
And
indeed.
they can send you to you really ought to talk to so and so. He or she knew this person or remembers this event or something like that. And then all you need is a first set of names, and then it just keeps rolling. And my other big helper in all this was Doris Oliver, an Ashe County native who lives over at Forest Ridge now, but she would do the same thing Evelyn was doing, except she didn't go with me on the interview. She would suggest to me people that knew about different things, and she and Evelyn both could tell me what was the most, what stuck out in their mind. And that's important because as somebody coming from somewhere else, you don't know what is important to the people that lived in the community versus something they didn't pay any attention to. And once you start getting all of these interviews together and all these different stories together, it's like putting together a great big puzzle. And the thing is to keep from repeating yourself, because a lot of people are telling the same story just from a different perspective. It's a very time consuming process, but one of the things that I pride myself on being able to do is to get people to talk to me. And once they start talking, these are people that uh, maybe haven't told these stories in a long, long time, or they've never told them to somebody outside the family. And once they feel comfortable with you and start talking, then just one thing leads to another, and you begin to see through their eyes what stands out in their memory, and that helps to guide you into what you want to focus on in your narrative. And it takes a lot of shuffling around, I don't put all the interviews like in a list. They go in different parts of the book that relate to what is happening in different, in the evolution of healthcare, or in the insight into the medical professionals that were in the area. And it was really neat to be able to talk to some of these people, like the two that I mentioned that I had interviewed, that have been under the care of all four generations in the Jones family. It's just a real treat. And that's the part of writing a nonfiction book that I like to be able to tell the story through the eyes of people that either lived it or knew somebody like their father or their grandfather or their grandma or something like that, that lived it. And that is just a great privilege to have somebody share those recollections and those insights with you. And then the story just writes itself through their eyes.
Well, Janet Pittard, author of A Hospital for Ashe County, 4 Generations of Appalachian Community Healthcare. What do you think is the best part of the book?
I think the best part of the book is the depiction of the community of Ashe County and how this thread of caring goes through the people looking after each other, goes through from the very beginning of when there weren't any doctors here to now. I use the 4 generations to kind of be the common thread of the story. It's not about the Jones family, but I use the Jones family and those generations of health professionals to pull the thread of the story all the way from the beginning of healthcare as as a thing to present day. And that's how the story tells itself. I wanted people to understand that even though it was Ashe County in those days was a rural, poor county, very isolated, that it was not a bunch of backwoods people that were ignorant of health care and didn't know anything. This was a community of people that maybe they didn't have a whole lot of money, but they knew what was important and they supported what was important. And that what was important to them was looking after one another. And I just think that is in a time period when there were 2 world wars and a Great Depression and all of these natural disasters like floods and things like that. These people still managed to come together and do what needed to be done to have health care for the community. And that's a pretty amazing thing. And I still think that while many people will say there's not things aren't like they used to be, and people couldn't pull that off like they say about World War II and the Greatest Generation. There are still people that believe in the community and the sense of community and the sense of caring. And I think that's something that should be celebrated and never ever lost or forgotten in a community's history and heritage.
My conversation with Janet C. Pittard, author of A Hospital for Ashe County, 4 Generations of Appalachian Community Healthcare, published by McFarland Books in 2016. You can purchase a copy of the book from McFarlandBooks.com and receive a 25% discount with code BESTPART. The executive producer for this podcast is Kim Hadley. Technical director is Chris Sparks. For Best Part of the Book, I'm Mark Purcell.